She had 40 seconds before the man on the table stopped being a man and became a statistic. The trauma bay smelled like copper and burnt rubber, and every doctor in the room was shouting the wrong orders. Maya Whitmore watched from the doorway, badge clipped crooked, scrub top still damp from a spilled IV bag. And she already knew three things nobody else in that room had figured out yet. The chest wasn't the primary bleed, the airway was compromised on the left, not the right, and the soldier lying on table 4 wasn't unconscious from pain. He was unconscious because he recognized her. She stepped through the door anyway. If you've ever been told you're not enough, not smart enough, not important enough, not worth listening to, stay with me until the end of this story. Like it, share it, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. Denver Falls didn't look like a city that kept secrets. It sat wide and flat against the eastern edge of the Rockies, the kind of place where people drove trucks with magnetic yellow ribbon decals and thought they understood sacrifice. The mountains were beautiful. The winters were brutal. The hospital, Hargrove Medical Center, 9 floors, 400 beds, one of the highest-rated trauma centers in the state, sat on a hill at the north end of downtown like it owned the skyline, which it more or less did. Maya Whitmore had worked there for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. She knew the ER the way she once knew a fire base. Exits, blind spots, the 2 wall outlets near Bay 7 that tripped when you ran more than 2 devices at once. The supply closet on sublevel 1, where the night staff kept a stash of decent instant coffee because the machine on the 2nd floor dispensed something that tasted like hot cardboard. She knew things about that building that the architects had probably forgotten. What the building did not know about her was considerably more significant. She arrived at 6:40 on a Tuesday morning in late November, 40 minutes before her shift started, because the bus she took from her apartment on Kellerman Street ran early on Tuesdays, and she had learned 2 years ago not to waste the time sitting on a bench outside. She used those 40 minutes to check the supply inventory in bays 1 through 4, confirm that the overnight staff had restocked the hemostatic gauze correctly. They almost never did. And review whatever cases were still open from the night before. She was pulling the inventory sheet for Bay 3 when Darren Okafor found her. Darren was a third-year resident, young enough to still have that eager, slightly exhausted look of someone who hadn't yet made peace with the gap between what medical school promised and what a trauma floor delivered. He was also, as far as Maya could tell, one of the only people in the building who spoke to her like she was a person instead of a piece of furniture that occasionally handed him things. "Cole's doing rounds early," he said, keeping his voice low like he was reporting enemy position. Maya didn't look up from the clipboard. "He always does rounds early when there's a performance review." "Whitmore." He waited until she made eye contact. "He already flagged your name this week, twice." She set the clipboard down. "For what?" "Monday. The thoracic patient. You adjusted his chest tube placement before Velasquez could countersign the order. The tube was kinked. He was deteriorating. I know that. You know that. Cole doesn't care." Darren glanced over his shoulder, which was unnecessary. They were alone in the bay. "He's been building a file. I saw it. It's not thin, Maya." She looked at him for a moment, then picked the clipboard back up. "Thanks for telling me." "That's all you've got?" "What do you want me to say, Darren?" He didn't answer because there wasn't a good answer, and they both knew it. Dr. Adrian Cole arrived on the trauma floor at 7:15 with 2 charge nurses flanking him like an honor guard and the specific energy of a man who'd spent the drive in practicing the speech he was about to give. He was 44, well-dressed in the way that trauma surgeons who had never actually loved surgery could afford to be. The kind of person who used the word metrics in clinical settings and meant it as a compliment. He had transferred in from a private practice group in Phoenix 8 months ago to take the ER directorship, and in those 8 months he had restructured the nursing assignment process, introduced a new triage algorithm that 4 of the senior nurses privately thought was worse than the old one, and developed what could most charitably be described as a fixation on Maya Whitmore. She didn't understand it exactly. She had theories. The most likely one was simply that she made corrections, and he noticed, and he was the kind of man who experienced a nurse making a correct judgment call as a form of personal insult. He found her at the central desk at 7:22. "Whitmore." He said her name like it was something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. "Dr. Cole." She was charting. She didn't stop. "We need to talk about the Galvez case. The chest tube was kinked. I documented the adjustment at 23:12. Dr. Velasquez countersigned at 23:19. After you'd already performed an unsanctioned intervention. 7 minutes after. The patient was stable by then. Cole set a folder on the desk in front of her. She recognized the format. It was the kind of folder HR generated when they were building a formal record. This is the third time in 6 weeks you've deviated from protocol without prior physician authorization. Maya looked at the folder and then looked back at her screen. In all 3 cases, the patient outcome was positive. That's not the point. I disagree. The 2 charged nurses behind him exchanged a look. Somewhere across the floor, a monitor beeped 3 times and went quiet. Cole leaned forward, dropping his voice to something that was trying to be quiet and was actually just pressurized. You are a floor nurse, Whitmore. Not a physician, not a PA, not a decision maker. You administer care that is ordered and authorized by physicians. That is your lane. If you cannot stay in your lane, this hospital cannot use you. Maya closed her chart. She turned in her chair and looked at him directly, which was apparently not the response he'd been expecting. 3 patients are alive because I didn't wait for authorization. 3 lawsuits are sitting in a filing cabinet because you don't know your place. There are no lawsuits. I checked. His expression shifted. Whatever warmth had been performing itself on his face dissolved. I'm placing you on a formal corrective action plan. Effective immediately, you are restricted from trauma bays 1 through 4 unless directly assigned by a supervising physician. Any deviation from that will result in suspension. Do you understand what I'm telling you? She held his gaze for 1 beat too long to be comfortable. I understand exactly what you're telling me. Good. He picked up the folder. Make sure you do. He walked away. The charged nurses followed. One of them, Tricia, who had been there 4 years and knew the floor better than most of the attendings, looked back at Maya once with an expression that was close to an apology. Maya turned back to her screen. Her hands were completely still. The morning ran the way mornings in a busy ER usually ran, which was to say badly, but not catastrophically. A construction worker came in with a crush injury to his right hand. A woman in her 60s who'd had a syncopal episode in the parking garage arrived via wheelchair with a blood pressure reading that made the intake nurse's eyebrows go up. A teenager with a laceration across his palm from what he claimed was a kitchen accident and what was obviously not. Maya moved through all of it with the quiet efficiency that had made her, in the opinion of most of the floor nurses and almost none of the physicians, one of the best trauma nurses in the building. She ate lunch alone in the break room at 12:40, which was 15 minutes later than she'd intended and 10 minutes earlier than she was going to get. A cup of the bad coffee from the second floor machine, because the instant stuff in sublevel 1 had run out and nobody had restocked it yet. A granola bar she'd been carrying in her scrub pocket since morning. She was reading a manual on pediatric trauma protocols, not because anything on the floor required it currently, but because she had always found that the gap between what she knew and what she'd need to know eventually was best treated as a project. When Lena Torres came into the break room. Lena was the most experienced charge nurse on the floor, 51 years old, with the patient, slightly tired competence of someone who had survived more hospital politics than any reasonable person should have to. She and Maya had never been close, exactly, but they had a respect for each other that was solid and unspoken, which was sometimes better. Lena sat down across from her without being invited, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. I heard about this morning, Lena said. Word travels. This floor runs on gossip and adrenaline, you know that. She wrapped both hands around her own coffee cup. He's not bluffing, Maya. The corrective action, that's a precursor. He's building toward termination. I know. Then you understand you need to be careful. I've been careful. Maya folded the corner of a page in the manual, then smoothed it back out. Careful enough that 3 people went home this month who otherwise wouldn't have. Lena was quiet for a moment. Why do you stay? She asked it like she'd been saving it up. You could work anywhere. Any ER in the state would take you inside a week. Better pay. Less. Whatever this is. Maya thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was complicated in ways she'd spent 2 years learning not to share. The simple answer was close enough to true. I know this floor, she said finally. I know where everything is. I know what this team does well and what it doesn't. It matters, that knowledge. Lena looked at her for a moment longer than the words required. He's not going to let this go. I know. So what are you going to do? Maya took a sip of the terrible coffee. My job. The call came in at 2:47 in the afternoon. Maya was in the supply room when the overhead alert fired. Not the standard incoming trauma signal, but the mass casualty notification. 3 rising tones followed by an automated dispatch voice that said, MCI event incoming. Multiple critical. ETA 11 minutes. All trauma staff to designated stations. She was moving before the announcement finished. The ER floor transformed the way it always did under MCI protocol. Structured chaos. People finding their stations with the automatic precision of people who had drilled this, fear sharpened into function. Maya went to Bay 4, which was her assigned station, and started pulling equipment, checking supplies with her hands more than her eyes, because her eyes were already on the board where the incoming information was starting to populate. Vehicle collision. Military convoy. Northbound on Route 7 near the Galloway interchange. Unknown number of casualties. Suspected critical injuries including blunt trauma and penetrating wounds. Military convoy. She stopped moving for exactly 2 seconds. Then she kept going. The first ambulances arrived at 2:58. 4 units in quick succession, lights and sirens cutting the late afternoon gray, and the controlled noise of the ER loading bay jumped to something raw and louder as the paramedics came through the doors fast, rattling off vitals and mechanisms of injury in the compressed shorthand of people who needed to transfer information and move. Maya heard the reports as she worked. Male, mid-30s, blunt chest trauma, GCS-12 on scene, BP dropping. Female, 20s, abdominal lac, penetrating fragment, conscious and combative. Male, 40s, significant TBI, unresponsive. The 4th unit came through the doors, and she heard the paramedic say something she was going to be thinking about for the rest of the day. This one's command. They were asking for him by name before we even got the doors open. His people don't want anyone touching him. She looked across the bay. The man on the gurney was large, somewhere in his mid-40s, in civilian tactical clothes that had been cut away by the paramedics in the field. He had a chest wound that was bad, but survivable if someone moved correctly. He had a secondary laceration on his left side that was going to be a problem in the next 10 minutes if nobody addressed it. His GCS was low, 8 or 9, she estimated from here. But his breathing pattern was wrong in a specific particular way that told her something the monitors hadn't caught yet. Dr. Velasquez was across the room with the abdominal case. Dr. Ewan was managing the TBI. Cole was standing at the edge of this bay with a tablet in his hands, directing traffic more than treating patients, which was what he generally did in high-volume situations. The man on the gurney's eyes opened for exactly 3 seconds. They found her across the crowded room, through the bodies and the equipment and the noise and the distance. His eyes found her like they'd been looking for her specifically, and something crossed his face that was not recognition the way a stranger recognizes a stranger. It was recognition the way a soldier recognizes another soldier. His mouth moved. No sound carried across the room, but she had spent years reading lips under conditions where sound didn't carry, and she read it clearly. Sparrow. Her old call sign. She had not heard that name in 4 years. Someone get to Bay 4, Cole called. Incoming command casualty, I need... Maya was already moving. She crossed the floor in 10 seconds, snapping on gloves as she went, already running her eyes over the monitors as the paramedic transferred his verbal handoff to her. She blocked out Cole's voice behind her, blocked out the noise from the other bays, and focused on what was in front of her. Left tension, she said to the nurse beside her. Young, first year on the floor, wide-eyed. Not right. The deviation is subtle. Don't let anyone prep the right side. Dr. Cole said, I need a 14-gauge needle, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line left side. Now. The young nurse hesitated for 1 second. Then she moved to get it. The man on the table, his convoy ID tag still attached to his torn jacket, read, Callaway R. Had 4 minutes, maybe 5, before the tension pneumothorax that nobody else had caught compressed his heart enough to stop it. Maya had seen this pattern before. She had seen it in places where the only thing between that pattern and a body bag was someone who had trained for 2 years in forward surgical teams, and then another 3 with a specialized medical support unit whose official designation would not appear on any paperwork she'd ever signed. She performed the decompression with the steady, careful economy of someone doing something they had done before. No wasted motion, no visible hesitation. The rush of air was audible to everyone in the bay. The monitor shifted, heart rate stabilizing, oxygen saturation climbing, absolute silence behind her, and then Cole's voice, very quiet and very sharp. "Whitmore, step away from that patient." She pulled off the first glove and reached for a fresh one, beginning her reassessment of the secondary wound. "He's stable enough to assess. The secondary is a lateral fragment wound. I need to confirm depth before—" I said step away. In approximately 4 minutes, he would have arrested from a tension pneumo that wasn't on anyone's radar. She kept her voice flat, factual, the way she'd learned to speak when the alternative was emotion she didn't have time for. "He's stable now. I need 2 minutes. You are on corrective action. You were explicitly restricted from these bays." Cole's footsteps were close behind her. "You just performed an unauthorized intervention on a critical patient, and I will have your badge for this." From the gurney, a voice came. Rough, slightly compressed, the voice of a man with a chest that hadn't quite reinflated all the way but was doing its best. "Get your hands off my medic." Cole stopped. Maya looked down. Colonel Rafe Calloway was conscious, GCS climbing, eyes tracking. His hand had moved, not much but enough, to close loosely around Cole's wrist. His grip, even compromised, was not casual. "Sir, you need to remain still," Cole said, and his voice had changed completely. "You're in a medical—" "I know exactly where I am." Calloway's eyes moved to Maya. His voice dropped. "Sparrow, what's my status?" She answered the way she'd been trained. "Tension pneumo, decompressed. Secondary wound, lateral, looks clean, but I want to confirm. You've got a concussive event, mild, from the vehicle impact. You're going to be okay." He held her eyes for a long moment. "Yeah," he said finally. "I know." Cole's voice was doing something complicated, trying to recalibrate, trying to find the authority it had lost when a wounded military officer dismissed him in 2 sentences. "I need everyone who isn't assigned to—" "Who is this man?" The voice came from the bay entrance. Not loud, not aggressive, just the kind of voice that stopped things. 3 people turned. 2 of them were in civilian clothes, but carried themselves in the specific way of people who had never fully left a chain of command. The woman at the front was in her early 50s, compact, wearing the kind of controlled expression that took years to develop. She had a federal badge clipped at her hip and the look of someone who had walked into rooms like this before and found them wanting. "I'm Special Agent Dara Voss," she said, "DoD Inspector General's office. Colonel Calloway is my principal. I need to know who made the decision to decompress and who's currently in charge of his care." Silence. Maya raised her hand. Voss looked at her. Then she looked at Cole. Then she looked at the monitors, the readings, the clinical reality of what had just happened in this bay. "Your name," she said to Maya. "Whitmore. Maya Whitmore." Something shifted in Voss's expression, barely perceptible, the way important things usually were. "We need to talk," she said quietly, "after you're done with him." Cole stepped forward. "I'm the director of this emergency department, and any conversation regarding patient care decisions should go through Dr. Cole." Voss said his name with the specific flatness of someone who had looked at a file and found it insufficient. "Please don't finish that sentence until you've spoken with your hospital's legal counsel." She looked back at Maya. "Whenever you're ready, Whitmore." Maya turned back to her patient. Her hands were steady. They had been steady the whole time. Behind her, she heard the sound of Cole's tablet hitting the edge of a counter. Not dropped, set down. The sound of a man trying to pretend he was still in control of a room that had quietly stopped belonging to him. Calloway's eyes stayed on her as she worked. They were alert now, clearer. The shock of the impact fading back to reveal the person underneath. Someone she had not seen in 4 years, had not spoken to in 4 years, had not once allowed herself to think about with anything other than the distant, careful neutrality she'd practiced like an instrument. "How long?" he asked quietly. She didn't pretend not to understand the question. 2 years here. Before that, 18 months in Salinas. Before that, I moved around." "You disappeared." "I needed to." She pressed lightly along the edge of the fragment wound, gauging depth. "I left." "I know why you left." His jaw tightened, not from pain. Some of us didn't want you to. She kept her eyes on what she was doing. It wasn't about what anyone wanted. The bay was quieter now. The other bays were still working. She could hear Velasquez calling orders across the floor, the ventilator cycling on the TBI case. But around this particular gurney, the world had contracted to something smaller and more specific. She finished her assessment and straightened up. No fragmentation depth concern. You'll need imaging to confirm, but my read is superficial. The chest is the priority. She pulled off the glove. You're going to want to tell me what actually happened on Route 7. Calloway looked at her for one long moment. His face did the thing faces did when someone was deciding how much to say, weighing things she wasn't privy to. Not here, he said finally. Then tell me when you can. Across the room, near the bay entrance, Agent Voss was speaking quietly into a phone. Cole had not left. He was standing near the secondary station, his tablet back in his hands, but he was not looking at it. He was watching Maya, and his expression had moved well past irritation into something that had more intent in it. Maya noticed. She had spent a long time in environments where noticing things like that was the difference between a manageable situation and a very bad one. She filed it carefully. The afternoon light was changing outside the high windows of the trauma floor, going gray, going cold, the November sky pressing down on Denver Falls the way it always did when the weather couldn't make up its mind. 2 more ambulances had arrived carrying convoy personnel with less severe injuries, and the floor was running at the outer edge of its capacity, every bay occupied, staff moving at the particular velocity of people who were working hard and knew it wasn't over. Maya was documenting her interventions at the central station when Darren found her again. His face was doing something new, not the careful warning of that morning, but something tighter, more immediate. Cole called hospital legal, he said, like 10 minutes ago, from his office. She typed without stopping. I know. Maya, I know, Darren. He was quiet for a moment, then, that woman from the federal government, she's been asking questions, not just about the colonel, about the convoy, about the crash. He lowered his voice further. She asked me whether the hospital received any communication about the convoy's route prior to the event. Maya's typing stopped. She looked at him. What did you tell her? That I didn't know, which is true. He met her eyes. But somebody in this building might. The implication sat between them like something with weight. Down the hall, the elevator opened. 2 more federal agents walked out. Different badges, different agency affiliation from the initials she clocked at 20 feet. And they moved with the directional purpose of people who already knew where they were going. They were heading toward the administrative wing. They were heading toward Cole's office. Maya looked back at her screen. Her documentation was accurate, time-stamped, detailed. Everything she had done this afternoon was in there, every step, every measurement, every clinical judgment with its reasoning attached. She had always documented that way, not because she expected to need it as protection, but because good documentation was a form of respect for the patient, for the record, for whatever came next. Whatever came next, in this case, was walking down the hallway in federal credentials, and it was moving faster than anyone in this building had anticipated. She saved her chart. She picked up the next one, and from Bay 4 she heard Colonel Rafe Calloway's voice, stronger now, clearer, talking to someone she couldn't see. And the words he said were not medical and not tactical and not anything she'd been trained to prepare for. Find out who had access to our route, he said. Start inside the hospital. Find out who had access to our route, Calloway said. Start inside the hospital. The words didn't echo. The trauma floor was too loud for echoing, but they landed in Maya's chest with a specific weight she recognized from another life. She had heard that tone before, in places that didn't appear on maps, from commanders who didn't ask questions they hadn't already half answered. Calloway wasn't speculating. He was confirming something he already suspected, and he was doing it from a hospital gurney with a decompressed chest and a lateral wound that still needed proper irrigation, which told her everything she needed to know about how serious he thought it was. She closed her chart and walked back to Bay 4. The 2 agents who had come off the elevator were still in the administrative wing. She could see the hallway from this angle, the frosted glass partition that separated the clinical floor from the offices, the shadow movement of people in conversation, the specific stillness of people who were listening more than talking. Cole's assistant, a young man named Brett, who was usually at his desk by the door, was not at his desk. Calloway was sitting up when she came back in, which he shouldn't have been, and the young nurse, Priya, first year, the one who'd gotten the needle, was standing beside him with the practiced, helpless expression of someone who had asked a patient to lie down 3 times and was considering a 4th attempt. "You should be flat," Maya said. "I've been in worse shape than this on a moving helicopter." He looked at her steadily. "You know that." "I know. You should still be flat." She moved to check his monitors anyway, running the numbers, looking at the trend. Stable. Not great, not where she wanted them, but stable. "Priya, can you get Dr. Velasquez when he's clear? I want a secondary assessment documented from a physician before we move him to imaging." Priya left, visibly relieved to have a task. Calloway waited until she was out of earshot. "Your director, Cole. What do you know about him?" "He transferred in 8 months ago from a private practice group in Phoenix. Prior to that, somewhere in Texas. Before that, I don't know." She adjusted his IV line without being asked. "He's been restructuring the department since he arrived." "Restructuring how?" "Protocol changes, triage algorithm, supply chain consolidation. He brought in a new vendor for a number of consumables about 3 months back." She paused. "Why?" Calloway's expression didn't change much, but the quality of his attention sharpened. "What vendor?" "I'd have to look it up. It came through the administrative memo system. I noticed because the hemostatic gauze they switched to is a different absorption rate than what we were using, and nobody adjusted the application protocol to match. So I did it myself and wrote it up and sent it to Cole, who..." She stopped. "Who ignored it?" "Get me the vendor name." "Rafe." She used his first name without thinking about it, the way she once had, and then caught herself. He noticed. She could see that he noticed, but he let it go. "You're going to tell me what this is." "When I can." He looked at her with the directness she remembered from a very different context. A forward operating base, a 2-person medical tent, a situation she wasn't going to think about right now. "You still trust your own read?" "Yes." "Then trust it now. Something about this hospital is connected to what happened on Route 7. I don't know the shape of it yet, but the convoy route was filed through a civilian coordination system because we were transporting non-combat personnel through an urban corridor. That filing went to 3 places." He held up 3 fingers, ticked them off. State Transport Authority, Federal Route Clearance, and the Regional Medical Coordination Hub for the receiving hospital. The receiving hospital. This hospital. Maya was quiet for 3 seconds, doing the math. The route was in our system, as of yesterday morning. She thought about Cole's assistant not being at his desk. She thought about the federal agents in the administrative wing. She thought about the memo she'd sent 3 months ago about the hemostatic gauze that had never received a response. "Who else on your team knows?" she asked. "Voss, 2 others. His jaw tightened. "We lost 1 person in the crash. Specialist, 23 years old, on her first field rotation. She was in the rear vehicle when it went over." He said it with the controlled flatness of someone who had learned to carry those facts without letting them stop him. But the control itself was visible if you knew to look for it. "I want to know who made that happen." Maya looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to get you that vendor name." The administrative record system was accessible from any nursing station on the clinical floor, but the deeper procurement records, vendor contracts, invoice histories, the paper trail of who had authorized what, lived in a secondary system that required department head clearance. Maya had never had that clearance. What she did have was 2 years of watching how the department functioned, which meant she knew that Lena Torres had administrative access she never fully used and generally left her workstation logged in during shift because she was in and out of the station all day and found the login process irritating. It was a bad security practice that Maya had mentioned twice in the past year. She was grateful for it now. She found Lena at the secondary station near the family waiting area, updating bed assignments, and she told her she needed 5 minutes at the workstation to pull procurement records for a patient care question related to the MCI cases. Lena looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman who understood she was being asked something slightly sideways of what was being stated, and then she stood up and said she was going to check on the family of the TBI patient, which would take her approximately 5 minutes. Maya sat down. The vendor name was in a contract addendum filed in the 3rd week of August. Stryker Valley Medical Supplies, Regional Distributor, contract authorized by A. Cole, countersigned by the hospital CFO. She wrote it on her palm with a pen from the station, low-tech and untraceable. She also noted the contract number and the authorization date. Then she logged out of the records, stood up, and replaced the chair exactly where it had been. Lena came back around the corner 2 minutes later. She looked at Maya's hand, at the ink there. She didn't say anything. "Thank you," Maya said. "I didn't do anything," Lena said, which was both true and not true, in the way that most useful things are. She found Agent Voss in the family consultation room at the far end of the hall, which the agents had apparently claimed as a temporary workspace. There was a tablet on the table and a satellite phone and a cup of coffee that was probably cold, and Voss was standing at the window looking out at the parking structure with her arms crossed and the expression of someone working through a problem from multiple angles simultaneously. She turned when Maya came in. She didn't look surprised. "Stryker Valley Medical Supplies," Maya said, and read out the contract number. "Authorized by Cole, late August, 3 months before the convoy crash." Voss took it in without writing anything down. "Where'd you get that?" "Procurement records." "You have access to procurement records?" "No." A beat. Voss allowed herself a small, dry expression that wasn't quite a smile. "Okay." She pulled out the satellite phone. "This goes up the chain right now. I need you to stay in the building." "I wasn't planning to leave." "I mean specifically, don't go anywhere isolated. Don't go to storage areas alone. If Cole asks to meet with you privately, he's going to try to get my badge. Let him try. Do not meet with him without a witness." Voss's eyes were direct and very calm, the kind of calm that wasn't the absence of urgency, but the management of it. "You understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand." Maya paused at the door. "The gauze. The hemostatic gauze he switched vendors on. I need to know if Stryker Valley's product has any flagged issues, supply chain problems, quality concerns, anything that went to a regulatory body." Voss looked at her. "Why?" "Because if someone wanted to compromise emergency response capacity at this hospital before a specific date, changing the consumable supplies would be a slow and nearly invisible way to do it. And I've been writing up the absorption rate discrepancy for 3 months. The room was quiet for a moment. Somewhere out in the corridor, a gurney wheel squeaked past, and a voice called out a room number, and the ordinary sound of the hospital continued around this small, still room where 2 women were standing with the growing shape of something ugly between them. "I'll run it," Voss said. "Stay visible." The floor was different when Maya came back out into it. Not louder, actually slightly quieter. The initial surge of the MCI response settling into the sustained work of stabilized patients. But the quality of the attention in the room had shifted. People were looking at her differently than they had this morning. Not all of them, and not dramatically, but enough. Darren fell into step beside her near the medication station. He didn't say anything immediately. He had a tablet in his hand, and he was making a show of reviewing something on it, which meant he had something to say and was being careful about how. "The SEAL guys," he said finally, keeping his eyes on the screen. "The ones with less severe injuries, bays 6 and 7. They've been asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "About the staff, specifically about you. Not weird questions. More like they wanted to know how long you'd been here, whether you were on today when the call came in, whether you were the first one at the Colonel's bay." He glanced at her sideways. "One of them asked Priya if you'd mentioned anything about the convoy before it arrived." Maya absorbed this. "What did Priya say?" "That you were in the supply room when the call came in and you didn't say anything unusual." He paused. "She also told them you diagnosed the tension pneumo in under a minute and that you did it without hesitation." "Priya talks a lot." "Priya is 26, and she just watched you do something she's going to be telling people about for the rest of her career." He lowered the tablet. "Maya, what is going on? And I mean actually. Because the federal agents are in Cole's wing, Cole's assistant has disappeared, and I just saw 2 military personnel walk into the hospital administrator's office, and nobody is telling the clinical staff anything." She thought about what she could say, and what she couldn't, and where those lines were. She thought about Voss telling her to stay visible. She thought about Calloway on the gurney, asking who had access to the route. "I need you to do something for me," she said. "Okay." "The records for beds 6 and 7, the convoy personnel. Make sure their care documentation is being captured correctly. Every intervention, every vital sign, every order. And if anyone tries to modify or access those records who isn't directly assigned to their care, I flag it. You flag it, and you don't tell anyone except me." He looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating what they thought they understood about a situation. "You think somebody in the building would mess with records?" She didn't answer, which was itself an answer. Darren exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "I'll watch it." She kept moving. She had 4 patients still needing documentation, a supply discrepancy she'd noticed during the initial surge that she wanted to reconcile before end of shift, and the growing specific awareness of Cole somewhere in this building, making phone calls that were probably not going well for anyone. She found out how not well at 4:37, when Cole appeared on the floor with a woman in a gray suit who turned out to be from Hospital Legal. Her name was Dr. Fenwick, according to her badge, though the PhD was in administration rather than medicine, and they walked directly toward Maya with the specific, purposeful stride of people who had agreed on a course of action in advance. "Whitmore." Cole's voice was doing something careful. "I need you to come with me. I'm in the middle of shift. This supersedes your shift. We need to have a conversation about the events of this afternoon, and we need to have it now, in my office, with legal present." Dr. Fenwick added with the professional neutrality of someone whose job was to be neutral, while things that were not neutral happened. "This is a formal interview under the hospital's clinical conduct protocol. You are entitled to union representation if you—" "I'll want a witness," Maya said. "My own." "You'll have access to union representation within, not union, a specific person, Dr. Okafor." She looked at Cole. "He's on the floor. I want him present." Cole's jaw moved. "This isn't a— I'm not going anywhere without a witness I choose." She said it the same way she'd said everything today. Level, factual, like she was reporting a vital sign. "That's not a negotiation." Fenwick murmured something to Cole. He listened. His expression went through several things quickly. Then he said, "Fine, get Okafor, my office, 10 minutes." He walked away. Fenwick followed. Maya watched them go. Behind her, she heard someone let out a breath. Tricia, the charge nurse, who was close enough to have heard the exchange, leaning against the station with her arms crossed. Their eyes met for a moment. Tricia gave a small nod, barely perceptible, and went back to what she was doing. It was not the same as what she'd been doing that morning when she'd walked away from Maya's confrontation with the apologetic backward look. Small things, they added up. Cole's office was on the 3rd floor, administrative wing, a corner room with a window that faced west toward the mountains. It was a comfortable office, leather chairs, a solid wood desk, the kind of diplomas on the wall that announced themselves, and it felt, in the late afternoon light, like a room that belonged to someone who believed their position was permanent. Maya sat across the desk from Cole. Darren sat beside her, which he'd agreed to with the resigned expression of a man who knew he was stepping into something he didn't entirely understand. Fenwick was at the end of the desk with a recording device and a notepad. Cole opened a folder. It was a different folder from this morning, thicker. He had been busy. "For the record," he said, "this interview pertains to the unauthorized clinical interventions performed by RN Maya Whitmore in the emergency department on the afternoon of November 19th, including specifically an unsanctioned needle decompression procedure performed on an unassigned military patient in direct violation of the corrective action restrictions communicated this morning." He looked up. He was composed. Whatever had thrown him on the trauma floor had been filed away into a format he could manage, which was this one: the formal process, the documentation, the language of institutional authority. "I'm giving you the opportunity to explain your actions," he said. "This explanation will be considered as part of the review." Maya looked at him steadily. "The patient was 2 to 4 minutes from cardiac arrest due to a missed tension pneumothorax. I performed the indicated intervention. He survived. That's my explanation. The intervention was outside your scope and authority. Saving a patient's life is always within my scope." Cole's pen moved across his notepad. "It has also come to my attention that you accessed administrative procurement records earlier this afternoon without authorization. Can you explain that?" Beside her, she felt Darren go very still. "I reviewed records relevant to patient care," she said. "Procurement records are not patient care records. When they affect consumable supplies used in patient care, they are." Cole set down his pen. He looked at her with something that had moved past professional irritation into something more calculated. Whitmore, I'm going to be direct with you. What happened today, your unauthorized interventions, your access of restricted systems, your apparent coordination with federal agents who are currently disrupting the administrative function of this hospital. This constitutes a pattern of serious misconduct. I am placing you on immediate suspension pending full review. Your badge and access credentials are to be surrendered to security before you leave the building today. He slid a document across the desk. Fenwick kept her eyes on her notepad. Maya looked at the document. She did not pick it up. Then Cole's office door opened. He hadn't knocked. The man who entered, mid-50s, military-bearing in civilian clothes that wore him the way civilian clothes always looked slightly wrong on people who had spent most of their lives in uniform, looked at Cole with the specific expression of someone who had entered a room in the middle of something and assessed it fully within the first 3 seconds. He held up a credentials wallet. DOD. Inspector General, same office as Voss, but the rank indicator on the badge was senior to hers. Colonel, retired, James Prentice, he said. IG's office. I need this room, Dr. Cole. You and your legal counsel are going to want to step out. Cole stood up. This is a private conduct interview, and you have no jurisdiction over. I have jurisdiction over the investigation into material support of an attack on military personnel operating under federal escort, which is currently underway in this building. Prentice's voice didn't rise. It had the quality of something that didn't need to rise. And part of that investigation involves reviewing the administrative decisions of this department over the past 8 months, including procurement records, access log entries for the hospital's route coordination system, and communications between this office and a company called Stryker Vale Medical Supplies. The room went absolutely quiet. Cole's hand, still resting on the desk, moved approximately 2 inches and stopped. I'd like to call my personal attorney, he said. His voice had changed completely. That's your right, Prentice said, and I'd recommend you exercise it fairly quickly. He held the door open. It was a gesture that managed to be both polite and entirely non-optional. After you. Cole walked out. Fenwick followed. The door closed. Prentice looked at Maya across the desk that had been Cole's and was now functioning as something else entirely. Behind him, through the window, the mountains were going dark in the November dusk, the snow line visible even from here, white against the gray-purple sky. Stryker Vale, he said. You found that. I found the contract. Agent Voss has it. She does. He sat down, in Fenwick's chair, not Cole's, she noticed. The company is a shell, third layer out from a logistics network that we've been tracking in connection with 2 other incidents in the past 14 months. Both involved military transport. Both involved a compromised receiving facility. He looked at her directly. Both had a civilian coordinator who had been placed in a position of authority 12 to 18 months before the incident. 8 months, Cole had been here. She did that math out loud. He was brought in to be here when the convoy came through. That's our working theory. Prentice's expression didn't soften, but something in it acknowledged the weight of what he was saying. The route was accessed from this hospital's administrative system at 11:42 p.m. last night. Cole's credentials, his access log. He might say it was a breach, that someone used his credentials without his knowledge. He might. Prentice nodded. That's why we're talking to every person in this hospital who had contact with his office in the last 72 hours. That's why Voss is pulling every communication log we can legally access tonight. He paused. And that's why what you found in the procurement records matters. It establishes a relationship that predates the credential access. It establishes preparation. Maya looked at her own hands for a moment. She thought about Specialist, 23 years old, in the rear vehicle. You're going to need Cole's full financial records, she said. Personal accounts, not just institutional. If he's been receiving payment through the supply contract, the billing structure would obscure it, but the payment intervals will be regular. Prentice looked at her for a long moment. You're not just a floor nurse. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway because he was going to find out regardless, and she preferred to say it herself. I was a combat medic, Navy, attached to JSOC medical support elements for 4 years. I left the service 5 years ago. Why did you leave? She met his eyes. Personal reasons. He let it sit there for exactly the length of time it took to communicate that he could push on it and was choosing not to. Okay. He stood up. I need you to write down everything you observed about Cole's behavior in the past 3 months. Anything that struck you as unusual. Documentation decisions, supply decisions, staffing decisions, his response to specific cases. Everything. How much time do I have? An hour, maybe 90 minutes. He looked at his watch. After that, this building is going to get considerably more complicated. Maya stood up. She was still wearing her scrubs. Her badge was still clipped to her pocket, which was notable given that she had been approximately 40 minutes from losing it when Prentice walked through the door. I'll need a room with a computer, she said. Consultation room 2 is clear. He was already moving toward the door. Voss will be outside it. She followed him out into the corridor. The administrative wing was different now. The quiet was a different kind of quiet, the kind that had people in it who were working very hard at not appearing to be doing anything in particular. She saw one of Cole's administrative staff, a woman named Greta, who had been here for 11 years and who Maya had always liked, sitting at her desk with her hands in her lap and an expression like someone sitting very still in a room where the lighting had changed and they hadn't decided yet whether to run. Maya stopped. Greta? The woman looked up. Her eyes were careful. You didn't know, Maya said quietly. Not a question, a recognition. Greta's jaw moved. She nodded once, barely. Maya kept walking. She was 3 steps from the consultation room when her pager went off. Not the standard alert. The specific triple tone of a code-level emergency, followed by the automated voice that she heard at the same moment it came over the overhead system in the corridor. Code Blue, Bay 4. Code Blue, Bay 4. Bay 4. Calloway. She was running before the announcement finished. The corridor between the administrative wing and the trauma floor was 40 meters and 2 corners, and Maya covered it in the kind of controlled sprint that didn't look like panic because it was the specific focused velocity of someone who knew exactly what they were running toward and exactly what they were going to do when they got there. Her badge slapped against her chest. Her shoes hit the linoleum in a rhythm she wasn't thinking about. She pushed through the double doors to the trauma floor at a speed that made them bang against their stops, and she heard the code team already working as she came around the second corner. Voices overlapping, the flat mechanical tone of the crash cart, the particular compressed urgency of people who were doing everything right and weren't sure it was going to be enough. Bay 4 had 4 people in it when she arrived. Priya was doing compressions, her arms locked and her weight dropping into it the way she'd been trained, face set with the effort and the fear underneath the effort. A second-year resident named Holbrook was at the airway, bagging, calling out oxygen saturation numbers that were not good. A respiratory tech was managing the cart. The 4th person was Velasquez, who had taken charge and was reading the rhythm off the monitor with his glasses pushed up on his forehead because he'd been wearing them on top of his head when the code fired and hadn't had time to deal with them. What happened? Maya moved to the bed rail, reading the monitor herself. VFib, Velasquez said without looking up. Came on fast. He was talking to his team member 20 minutes ago. No, has he been shocked? 1 round, no conversion. She looked at the rhythm. Coarse ventricular fibrillation, the monitor showing the chaotic spiking pattern of a heart that was contracting without coordination, not pumping anything. Her eyes went from the monitor to the patient to the IV line to the medication log on the cart, and she processed it in the way she'd learned to process things in environments where the cost of missing something was immediate and final. What's his potassium from the last draw? Holbrook looked up. The labs weren't back yet from... Get them, now. She looked at the medication log. What did he receive in the last 2 hours? Priya, still compressing, called out without breaking rhythm. Normal saline 2 units. Morphine 5 milligrams at 1500. Ondansetron at 1520. Maya looked at the saline bag. It was a standard hospital bag, standard labeling, hanging from the standard hook. Something was wrong with the saline bag. She couldn't have said exactly what triggered it. The angle of the light, the way the label sat slightly off-center, a density in the fluid she wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't been specifically looking. But she'd spent 2 years noticing things on this floor that other people didn't notice. And before that, she'd spent 4 years in environments where trusting a wrong read meant someone died. Stop the infusion, she said. Holbrook blinked. The saline? Stop it, and don't touch the bag. Don't disconnect it. Just clamp the line. He needs fluid volume. If we clamp the line. She was already moving to the secondary port, pulling a fresh bag from the crash cart supply, spiking it herself. New line, fresh bag from the cart. Don't use anything from his existing IV setup until we've had it tested. Velasquez looked at her sharply. You're saying the bag is contaminated. I'm saying I want it tested before we continue infusing it into a man who just went into ventricular fibrillation without a clear precipitating cause. She got the new line running. Charge to 200. I'm the attending on this code, Velasquez said, but he said it without force, the way someone says something because they're supposed to and not because they mean it. Yes, she agreed, you are. Charge to 200. He nodded to the tech. The cart whined. Clear. Priya pulled back. The shock hit. The monitor flatlined for one horrible second, then resumed its chaotic pattern. No conversion. Again, 250. Holbrook had the lab results on his tablet now. He read them out and his voice did something strange halfway through. Potassium is 7.1. 7.1. Normal was 3.5 to 5. At 7.1, the cardiac muscle became electrically unstable, the membrane potential disrupted enough to send the rhythm into chaos. At 7.1, VFib made sense in a way that had nothing to do with the patient's underlying condition and everything to do with what had been going into his IV line. Potassium toxicity, Velasquez said. He said it quietly, like a door closing. In that saline bag. Maya kept her voice flat. Not a clinical dose, a toxic one. She looked at the bag hanging clamped from its hook. Don't let anyone touch it. Clear. The second shock hit. The monitor spiked, held, and then, not smoothly, not the way it happened in simulations, it stumbled into something, an irregular rhythm, then finding itself, then the distinct, unmistakable shape of sinus rhythm resolving on the screen like a sentence finishing itself. Nobody in the room said anything for 3 seconds. Then Priya made a sound that was not quite a word, and Holbrook's shoulders dropped 2 inches, and Velasquez said, Okay. Okay, we've got him. Calcium gluconate, 1 gram IV push. Let's start on reversing this. I want sodium bicarb and continuous cardiac monitoring, and I want security on this bay right now. Maya was already at the door, pulling her phone. She called Voss. It rang once. The saline bag in Bay 4 has been tampered with, she said when Voss picked up. Potassium loaded. He went into VFib. He's in sinus now, but it was close. She looked back through the bay window at Calloway, who was still unconscious, monitors now showing the fragile, hard-won stability of someone who had been brought back from the edge. Whoever did this had access to the bay in the last 2 hours. They had to get to the bag after it was hung. A pause. Then Voss said, I'm coming to you. There's something else. Maya watched Holbrook working at the bed, watched Priya documenting with shaking hands, watched Velasquez on his own phone calling the intensivist. Cole was removed from the floor at approximately 1640. The bag was hung at 1500, but it might not have been loaded at hanging. Potassium can be injected through the bag port after the fact. Someone could have done it in the last hour, meaning after Cole was already under escort, meaning Cole may not have done this part himself. Another pause, longer. There's someone else in this building. Yes, Maya said. I think there is. The next 30 minutes moved the way time moves in a crisis. Not fast exactly, but compressed, each minute containing more events than it should have been able to hold. Security came to Bay 4. Velasquez gave them the bag and the IV setup with the controlled fury of a physician who had understood in real time that someone had tried to use his patient care to commit a murder and was not processing that fact well. Voss arrived with Prentice behind her, and she took one look at the bagged IV line and made a phone call that brought 2 more federal personnel off the elevator within 10 minutes. Maya gave her account in the corridor outside the bay, standing, not sitting, because sitting felt wrong. She told them what she'd seen, what she'd deduced, what the lab values meant. She told them the timeline. She told them that whoever had accessed that bag had done it while the code team's attention was elsewhere, which meant either someone with clinical credentials and a reason to be near the bay, or someone who had waited until the floor was maximally occupied with the MCI response and then moved. The floor was at peak activity from 1500 to 1700, she said. 40-plus patients, all bays occupied, staff moving constantly. That's the window. Prentice was listening with his arms crossed and the expression of a man filing things in real time. Who had unaccounted movement during that window? I don't know. I was in the administrative wing from approximately 1630 onward. She paused. But the access log for the trauma floor will show badge swipes. Everyone who came through the secure doors during that period. We're pulling it, Voss said. You want the camera footage too. Maya looked at the ceiling corner of the corridor where the hospital's internal camera system had a unit positioned to cover the entrance to the trauma bays. But the camera on Bay 4's direct exterior has been offline for 6 days. I reported it to facilities. It hasn't been repaired. Voss and Prentice exchanged a look. 6 days, Prentice said. I have the maintenance request in writing. It went to facilities operations, which falls under the administrative director's office. She met his eyes. Which is Cole. The picture was assembling itself piece by piece, and it was not a complicated picture once you had the pieces. Cole had placed himself at the center of enough administrative systems, maintenance, procurement, staffing, route coordination, that he could manage conditions without appearing to manage them. The camera going down, the gauze vendor change, the route access. These were not the actions of a man making spontaneous decisions. These were the actions of a man who had spent 8 months building a very specific set of conditions. But the potassium in the IV bag, that was operational. That was someone with hands-on access, clinical knowledge, and a backup plan for when Cole's removal from the floor threatened to leave the primary objective unfinished. There was a second person, and that person was still somewhere in this building. Voss pulled Maya aside while Prentice coordinated with the security team. The family consultation room, again, door closed, the sounds of the floor muffled but present. The badge access log for the trauma floor, Voss said. She had a printout, printed in the last 10 minutes, apparently, from somewhere, and she put it on the table between them. 43 badge swipes in that 2-hour window. 37 are clinical staff who were documented as active during the MCI response. The other 6, she pointed, 4 are physicians covering patient movement between bays. 1 is housekeeping. 1 is unidentified. Maya looked at the printout. The unidentified swipe was at 16:52, late enough to be after the main surge, early enough to still fit within a floor running at maximum distraction. Unidentified how? She asked. The badge number doesn't correspond to any current employee, physician, or contractor in the hospital's HR system. Visitor badge? Visitor badges have a different prefix. This one has the clinical staff prefix. Voss tapped the number. It's a cloned badge. Somebody made a copy of a staff credential. A cloned credential. To get through the secure door to the trauma bays, you needed either a staff badge or an escort. A cloned badge solved that problem cleanly and left nothing obvious on the physical security record. Just a badge number that looked right until someone ran it against the employee database, which no one would do in real time in the middle of a mass casualty response. Who's the source badge? Maya asked. The one that was cloned? We don't know yet. The cloning process would leave the original functional. The employee it belongs to probably has no idea. Voss folded the printout. We're running it. Maya thought about the floor. She thought about who moved through it during that window, who would have had reason to be near Bay 4, who had the clinical knowledge to identify and access an IV bag without raising immediate alarm. She thought about all of it and arrived at the same uncomfortable answer from 3 different directions. It's someone who knows how to move on a clinical floor, she said. Not a tech, not support staff. Someone who looked like they belonged. Yes. Then you need to look at anyone who came into this building today with a credential you didn't vet. She looked at Voss, including anyone who came in with the convoy. Voss went very still. The convoy transported wounded personnel, Maya said carefully. Most of them were accounted for immediately, but the logistics support, the convoy escorts, the non-combat personnel Calloway mentioned transporting, were all of them injured? Were all of them tracked from the crash site to this facility? The answer was in Voss's expression before she said anything. It was the expression of someone realizing they had assumed something they shouldn't have. I need to make a call, Voss said. Make it fast. Maya went back to the trauma floor because the floor still had patients on it, and those patients still needed care. And because standing in a consultation room waiting for other people to act was something she had never been good at, and wasn't going to start practicing now. She checked in on the recovering convoy personnel in bays 6 and 7. 2 men, 1 woman, all in stable condition, all watched over by a military escort who was now considerably more alert than he had been 2 hours ago. She checked Calloway's updated vitals through the bay window rather than going in. The intensivist had taken over his care and the bay was appropriately occupied and she was not going to crowd it. She found Darren at the central station. He had the expression of someone who had been trying to hold a normal shift together while the world around him stopped being normal. "Records are intact," he said before she could ask. "Nobody touched them." "Good. How is he?" "Stable. It was close." He absorbed this. "The floor is... People know something is wrong. Not the details. But security has been through twice. The federal people keep coming and going. Cole hasn't been visible in 2 hours. And everyone is doing that thing where they keep their head down and work really hard and don't ask questions out loud. That's probably the right call right now. Is it going to get worse?" She looked at the floor. The bays, the monitors, the movement of her colleagues through the familiar geography of a building she knew better than most of the people in it. "For a little while," she said honestly, "and then it's going to get a lot clearer." She was halfway through the medication reconciliation she'd been trying to finish since 3 o'clock when the overhead paging system activated. Not a code. Not a mass casualty alert. The administrative PA system, the one that was used for general announcements, which almost never activated during active clinical hours. "Attention all staff, this is a security notification. The hospital is currently under an active security protocol. All non-essential personnel are asked to remain in their current work areas. All external building access points are now under security monitoring. This is not a drill. Please remain calm and continue your duties." The floor went quiet. Not the working quiet of people focused on tasks. The specific quiet of people who have just been told something they don't fully understand and are holding very still while they process it. Trisha appeared at Maya's elbow. "What does that mean?" "It means stay where you are." "Maya, it means someone knows there's a threat in the building and they're containing it." She kept her voice low and her tone level. "Keep the floor running. That's what it means for us right now." Trisha looked at her for a moment with the complicated expression of a woman who was frightened and competent and was choosing to let competence win. Then she nodded and went back to her station. Maya's phone buzzed. A message from Voss, 3 words. "We have a name." She was moving toward the consultation room when Holbrook nearly walked into her coming out of Bay 3. He was pale in the specific way of people who have seen something they hadn't expected to see. "There's a man in Bay 3, he said. "The one we treated from the convoy. The logistics coordinator, the civilian. He's been asking to use a phone." "He doesn't have his own?" "He says it was damaged in the crash. He's been asking specifically for an outside line, not a hospital line." Holbrook's voice dropped. "I told him I'd check on it, but something felt, I don't know, something felt off." Maya looked at him for exactly 1 second. "Which side of Bay 3 is he on?" "Left, bed B." "Don't give him a phone. Tell him the system is down due to the security protocol. And don't leave him alone." She touched Holbrook's arm briefly. "You did right to come to me." She changed direction. Voss was in the main corridor, moving fast. Prentice behind her, 2 agents flanking. They were heading toward Bay 3. "Civilian coordinator from the convoy," Maya said as Voss reached her. "Bed 3B. He's been asking for an outside line." "Harlan Metz," Voss said. 41, registered as a logistics coordinator with a defense contracting firm. His employment verification is clean back 2 years and fraudulent before that." She was already moving past Maya. "He has a secondary credential we found on the badge cloning analysis. The clone sourced from his legitimate ID. He used his own badge as the template and masked the employee ID number. He'd cloned his own badge. He walked through the secure doors himself, left a record that looked like an unknown entry, and walked back out. The access log showed an unidentified badge. The camera was down. On a floor running at maximum capacity during a mass casualty event, nobody had looked twice at a man in a patient gown moving toward a specific IV bag. They went into Bay 3 together. Metz was in the bed on the left, sitting up, the expression on his face doing something complicated when Voss came through the door. Not surprise exactly, more like a man who had calculated odds and was recalculating them very fast. "Harlan Metz," Voss said. You are being detained under federal authority, pending investigation into conspiracy to commit murder, sabotage of military operations, and material support of an attack on federal personnel. Metz looked at her. He looked at Prentice. He looked at Maya, standing in the doorway, in her scrubs with her clipped badge and the steady, unremarkable presence of a woman who had been in this building for 2 years and had noticed every wrong thing about it. "I want a lawyer," he said. "That's fine," Voss said. "You can have one." The agents moved in. The room was efficient about it. The whole thing took under a minute, which was faster and quieter than Metz had probably expected, and he was escorted out of the bay past the nursing station with the agents close on either side and Prentice behind them, and the staff on the floor watched with the frozen attention of people witnessing something outside the normal grammar of their workday. Darren was at the station. He looked at Maya. His mouth started to form a question, and then he seemed to decide it could wait. She went back to Bay 4. She stood outside the window. Inside, Calloway was on continuous monitoring, the intensivist documenting at the bedside, vitals steady on the screen, still not where she wanted them, still recovering from the chemical assault on his cardiac muscle, but stable, present, alive. He was alive because she'd looked at a saline bag and something had been wrong with it. She could not have told you exactly what. She could tell you it wasn't magic and it wasn't instinct in the mystical sense. It was pattern, recognition, built from years of seeing things in conditions that didn't allow for second chances, refined by 2 years of watching a floor that she'd learned in the specific way she learned all things, completely and without shortcuts. The intensivist looked up and saw her through the window. He gave a brief professional nod. She nodded back. She was walking back toward the central station when Prentice came off the elevator. He moved through the floor with the same directional purpose he'd had all afternoon, but there was something different in it now. Something that had resolved from urgency into the more measured momentum of a case that had found its shape. He found her at the station. "We've confirmed the connection between Metz and Stryker Valley. He's a field operative for the logistics network we've been tracking. Cole was the placement. His job was infrastructure. Metz was operational backup, there to complete the objective if Cole was neutralized before the job was done." Which is what happened. When we walked Cole out of his office, Metz had the clinical knowledge and the access to move to a backup plan. He looked at her steadily. He would have succeeded. The potassium concentration in that bag was enough to cause fatal cardiac arrest within 4 to 6 hours of infusion. It was calibrated to look like a complication of the chest trauma. He paused. The medical examiner would probably have called it a cardiac event secondary to trauma-related physiological stress. Secondary to trauma-related physiological stress. Nobody would have looked twice. "How did you see it?" Prentice asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the quality of the light and the off-center label and the density she'd perceived in the fluid, and she thought about the years that had made her capable of perceiving it. "The bag was slightly overfilled," she said finally. "Potassium chloride concentrate would have been injected through the port after hanging. That adds volume. A standard saline bag has a specific fill level. You see enough of them. You notice when one is different." Prentice was quiet for a moment. 1 millimeter of variance. Approximately. He exhaled. It was a small sound, but it carried a lot in it. "We have Cole in federal custody. Metz is being processed. The network connection is going to take time to unpack fully, but we have enough to hold both of them without bail and enough to build the case." "And Calloway?" "He'll be transferred to a military medical facility tonight when he's stable enough. His team is already being informed." He looked at her. "He asked for you. Before the code. He asked one of the agents to make sure you were going to be okay after today." She absorbed this without letting it show on her face. "He always thought about his people that way." "Is that what you were?" Prentice asked. "His people?" She looked at him evenly. "I was a member of his medical support element. 4 years. He was a good commander." "Is that all?" She held his gaze. "That's what I have to say about it." He accepted this without pressing it, which she respected. "I'm going to need your full statement tonight. Everything. Cole, the gauze, the vendor, the code, the bag. All of it documented and signed." "I know." "After that," he stopped. Started again. "There are going to be questions. About your service record. About why you left. About what you've been doing for the past 5 years. He said it without apology, but also without cruelty, which was the honest version of telling someone that something private was about to become less so. Some of those questions are going to come from people with more authority than me. I know that too, she said. She did know. She'd known it was coming from the moment Calloway's eyes had found hers across the trauma bay and his mouth had formed her call sign, the one she hadn't used in 4 years. She had known it was the end of one version of the quiet life she'd built here. She hadn't decided yet whether she was afraid of that. She was still working through it when the elevator at the far end of the corridor opened and 3 people walked out. 2 of them were in military dress uniform, which was notable enough on a hospital floor that 2 nurses at the station looked up immediately. The third was in the same civilian clothes they'd been wearing all afternoon, Agent Voss. But she was carrying a folder with a different seal on it than the one she'd had before. A seal that Maya recognized from a category of documents she hadn't seen in 4 years. Voss walked to her with the specific directness of someone who had something to say and wanted to say it before she lost the nerve, which Maya would not have guessed Voss had the capacity to lose. She held out the folder. "Your service record," Voss said. The classified portions were reviewed by the IG's office and the relevant command authority this afternoon. Given the events in this building today, they've authorized a summary disclosure. She paused. "Your commanding officer's evaluations. Your commendations. The citations for the 3 extractions you were involved in during your last deployment." Maya looked at the folder. She didn't take it yet. "Maya." Voss's voice dropped slightly. "They classified your record when you left. Not as standard procedure, specifically. There's a notation, a request to suppress your evaluations and your citation record from the personnel database accessible to civilian employers." The floor was quiet. The monitors beeped. Someone 2 bays over called a medication confirmation. "Who requested it?" Maya said. Voss looked at her. There was something in her expression that was not quite pity and was close to a recognition of wrong. "Your record was suppressed at the request of a superior officer," she said carefully, "whose name is also in this folder. Someone who had reason to want your qualifications to remain invisible to civilian institutions." Maya felt something move through her that she was not going to call shock, because it was not quite that. It was more like the particular sensation of a thing you've suspected for a long time, finally stepping out of the dark and presenting itself. She took the folder. She opened it. The name on the suppression request was one she recognized, a signature she had seen on orders and evaluations and transfer documents for 4 years. And it was not a name she had ever expected to see connected to the reason she'd been invisible for 5 years. Her hands did not shake, but it was close. Her hands did not shake, but it was close. The name on the suppression request was Brigadier General Wallace Pruitt. She had served under him for the last 18 months of her deployment. Not directly, not in the day-to-day command sense, but in the organizational structure where his signature appeared on transfer orders and evaluation summaries, and the kind of administrative decisions that shaped a service record without ever quite announcing themselves as decisions. She had respected him the way you respect someone at a remove. Functionally, professionally, without the kind of personal knowledge that would complicate it. She had also testified against one of his staff officers. Not publicly. Not with her name attached to the final report. The process had been internal, classified, the kind of accountability mechanism that the military ran when it wanted to address something without appearing to address it. She had told the truth about what she had witnessed during a specific operation in a specific location whose name still appeared nowhere in any document she could legally discuss. The staff officer, a major, someone she had worked alongside for 8 months, had been quietly separated from service. Pruitt had never said anything to her directly. He had been professional. He had signed her transfer papers without comment. And then, 6 weeks after her separation from the service, when she had been in Salinas trying to figure out what a person did with skills that had no civilian translation, she had applied to 3 hospital systems and received polite rejections from all 3. It had taken her another 8 months to find work, and she had never fully understood why. Now she did. She closed the folder. She handed it back to Voss. "How long have you known this was in there?" she asked. The suppression flag was in the IG's review file for the network investigation. It came up this afternoon when we were pulling everything connected to Cole's background check and employment authorization. Voss held her gaze. Cole's placement at this hospital was approved through a regional contractor review process. One of the background reference points in that process was a military consultation clearance. The officer who signed off on Cole's civilian suitability review was Pruitt. Yes. Maya thought about that for exactly as long as it took to understand the shape of it. Pruitt had suppressed her record to reduce her ability to find stable clinical employment, which was almost certainly retaliatory, a consequence of the testimony, whether or not it was framed that way. And Pruitt had also signed off on Cole's suitability review, which connected him to the same network that had placed Cole in this hospital for the specific purpose of compromising military convoy operations. One name. Two separate lines of damage, converging on the same building, the same floor, the same woman standing in a hospital corridor on a Tuesday in November with a clipped badge and 4 years of deliberately erased qualifications. Is Pruitt part of the active investigation? She asked. As of 40 minutes ago, Prentice said from beside Voss. Yes. The two officers in dress uniform were still standing at the elevator. They had not approached. They were waiting with the practiced patience of people who had been told to wait, and were doing it correctly. Who are they? Maya asked. Judge Advocate General's office, Prentice said. They drove up from Peterson. They're here about your service record, specifically the authorization to declassify and restore it. He paused. And they have some questions about General Pruitt. She gave her questions to the JAG officers in the same consultation room that had served as an impromptu federal workspace for most of the afternoon. It was 7:43 by the time they sat down, and the hospital outside the room had settled into its evening rhythm. Shift change, dinner trays, the quieter register of a building that had survived something large and was still processing it. The officers were thorough. They were also, she noticed, careful with her, not soft, not solicitous, but careful in the way of people who understood they were asking someone to revisit something that had cost her something real. She answered everything they asked. She answered it in the same flat, accurate voice she'd been using all day, because that was the voice that worked, and because the alternative was a version of this conversation she didn't have the energy for at 7:43 after the day that today had been. They asked about the testimony. She told them what she'd witnessed. She told them what she'd reported. She told them the timeline of her separation from the service and the 8 months of rejection that had followed, which she had spent believing was simply the difficulty of translating military medical experience to civilian hiring contexts. She told them what the folder had just told her. The senior JAG officer, a lieutenant colonel named Ferris, gray-haired, with the particular watchfulness of someone who'd spent a career parsing conflicting accounts, wrote notes in a way that was slower and more deliberate than the event seemed to require, which meant he was writing things between the lines as well as in them. The suppression of your evaluation record was irregular, he said. It didn't go through standard channels. It appears to have been entered into the personnel system directly at the senior officer level, which is possible, but essentially never done for this purpose. Which means it was deliberate. It was almost certainly deliberate. He looked at her. I want to be direct with you, R.N. Whitmore. The IG investigation into Pruitt is in early stages. What we can confirm today is that the suppression of your record was improper and has been reversed. Your full evaluation history and commendation record are restored effective this evening. He held out a document. This is confirmation of that restoration. She took it. She looked at it. On paper, it was a correction of an administrative record. In terms of what it meant, 2 years at Hargrove, 2 years of being the nurse that no major system had wanted, 2 years of being told in 100 indirect ways that she wasn't the right fit, wasn't quite enough, wasn't worth the overhead of her confidence. It was something considerably more than administrative. She folded it and put it in her scrub pocket. What happens to Pruitt? She asked. That depends on what the investigation finds and how thoroughly the network connection is established. If the connection between his authorization of Cole's placement and the operational network holds up, Ferris set down his pen. It won't be administrative. She nodded once. That was enough. She was outside the consultation room, standing in the corridor with the particular emptiness of someone who has been in motion all day and has suddenly run out of immediate tasks, when Darren found her for what felt like the 15th time that day. He looked exhausted. He also looked like someone who had made a decision about something. Lena wants to know if you're okay, he said. She won't come ask you herself because she has 17 things to chart before handoff, but she wants to know. Tell her I'm okay. Are you? She leaned against the wall. The corridor was quiet. Down at the bay end, she could see through the window into Bay 4, where Calloway's monitors were still running their steady lines. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me tomorrow." He nodded like that was a reasonable answer, which she appreciated. "The floor covered everything," he said after a moment. "While you were dealing with all of that, nobody dropped a ball. Priya documented the whole code by herself, correctly, in real time. Holbrook stayed at Calloway's side through the whole potassium reversal. Trisha ran the evening admission solo for an hour." He paused. "Nobody needed Cole to do it." Maya looked at him. "No," she said quietly. "They didn't, Mom." The arrest of Adrian Cole was processed at the federal level, which meant it happened in documentation and phone calls, and the movement of people through administrative spaces rather than in anything visible to the clinical staff. The floor found out the way floors found out things, in pieces, through the lateral information network of a building where 200 people worked and things did not stay contained. By 9 o'clock, the general shape of it was known. Cole had been taken into federal custody. There were agents in the building. Something serious had happened that was connected to the military convoy crash. The specific details, the route data, the vendor network, the IV bag, the suppression of a nurse's record by a senior military officer. Those stayed in the smaller room of people who needed to know them, at least for tonight. Maya charted until 9:45, finishing everything she'd been unable to complete during the afternoon. She charted with the same precision she always used, and she noticed, somewhere around the third patient record, that she was charting differently, not in her process, which was the same as it had always been, but in the awareness underneath it. Something about having her record restored, having the suppression reversed, had shifted the weight of the ordinary act. She had always charted carefully. Now she charted with the knowledge that the careful documentation belonged to a person whose qualifications were visible again. It was a small thing. It didn't feel small. Voss came to find her at 10:20 while she was at the central station finishing the last item on her list. She sat down in the chair beside Maya without asking, which at this point in the day felt like a reasonable liberty. "Cole's attorney arrived at 9, she said. "He's not talking, which is expected. Metz is a different story. He's been talking since they put him in the car. He's not giving us the upper levels of the network because he doesn't know them, which is how these structures are designed. But he's giving us everything at his operational level, and that's enough to connect Cole definitively to the route access and the logistics planning." She looked at Maya sideways. "Cole had records on you." Maya stopped typing. "What kind of records?" "Surveillance. Not physical. Digital. Your employment history. Your application rejections. He knew your background was suppressed, which means he knew the suppression existed, which means he had a contact who had access to the personnel system." Voss set a tablet on the desk beside Maya's keyboard. On the screen was a document, a communication log. He received a briefing on the hospital staff as part of his placement preparation. Your name is in there. The notation next to it says, "No threat, record suppressed, civilian status confirmed." Maya looked at the screen. She read the line twice. "No threat," she said. "Yeah." He placed himself in this hospital in part because he knew I was here, and he knew I was, supposedly, neutralized. That's our read. Voss's voice was level, but something in it was not neutral. The same record suppression that was meant to diminish you is the reason they thought this building was safe to use. The specific and terrible irony of that sat between them for a moment. They put themselves in the building where I worked, Maya said, because they thought making me invisible had also made me harmless. Yes. She looked at the communication log for another few seconds, at the line with her name and the notation beside it, and then she looked away. There was something in it she was going to need more time and more distance to fully feel, and tonight was not the time. "What do you need from me before tomorrow?" she asked. "Your written statement, which I know you haven't had time to produce yet. It can wait until morning." Voss paused. "And I need you to know that the statement you give will be part of the federal case record, which means it's going to be public eventually. Your name, your background, what you did today." "I know." "You've had your record suppressed for 5 years. Some people in your position would want to stay quiet even now." Maya looked at her steadily. "Some people didn't just pull potassium out of a dying man's IV line." Voss held her gaze for a moment, and then she nodded once, with the small, precise movement of someone giving a thing its proper acknowledgement. "I'll need you back here at 8. I'll be here at 6:40. Voss almost smiled. Of course you will. Harlan Met's full cooperation with federal investigators produced, over the next 14 hours, a picture of the operational network that was both more extensive and more structurally fragile than anyone had initially assessed. The network relied on placed individuals and institutions, medical, logistical, administrative, who gathered and transmitted information without direct coordination with one another, which made it difficult to unravel from any single thread, but also meant that losing one node didn't alert the others. Cole had been a node. Metz had been a failsafe. What neither of them had accounted for was Maya Whitmore. That sentence appeared in the IG's preliminary report, drafted by Prentice's office during the same overnight hours that Metz was talking and Cole's attorney was building a silence. It appeared in the section describing the operational breakdown, the sequence of events in which the plan had failed. And it was not a sentence that anyone had intended to be poetic, but it was precise, and precision has its own weight. By 6 the following morning, the federal case against Cole was substantive enough that bail was denied at his initial hearing. The case against Metz was stronger, given his cooperation, but his cooperation had a ceiling, and above that ceiling was the organizational structure neither of them had full knowledge of. Pruitt's investigation was ongoing, confined to the military justice system, and moving in the deliberately measured way of things that were serious enough to be careful. Maya arrived at Hargrove at 6:38, 2 minutes ahead of her standard early arrival, and she stood for a moment at the staff entrance before she badged in. The building looked the same as it had every morning for 2 years and 3 months. It was the same building. She was not quite the same person who had walked in yesterday, and she stood there for exactly long enough to acknowledge that before she went through the door. The morning shift was different in its texture. People knew more than they had the night before. The news of Cole's federal arrest had moved through the informal channels overnight, and the staff she passed in the corridor looked at her with a range of expressions that included surprise, reassessment, and in a few cases something close to embarrassment. She did not stop to address any of them. She went to the supply room and checked the hemostatic gauze inventory because the hemostatic gauze was still the wrong absorption rate, and that was still a patient care issue regardless of everything else. Calloway had been transferred at 4 in the morning, stable, to a military medical facility 60 miles south. She'd known he would be. She had not said goodbye because he'd been sedated for the transfer, and also because she was not sure goodbye was the right word for whatever it was she and Rafe Calloway had been to each other in the distant past and the complicated present. There was a note, though. Prentice brought it to her at 7:15, handwritten on a piece of paper that had clearly been torn from a small notebook, the handwriting of someone doing it left-handed because their right arm was the one with the IV port. You always saw what other people missed. Some of us always knew that. RC. She read it once. She put it in the same pocket as the record restoration document. At 8 o'clock, she gave her formal statement to Voss and Prentice in the consultation room. It took 90 minutes. She was accurate, thorough, and she did not editorialize because the facts were sufficient, and she had learned in a different context that facts presented cleanly carried more force than facts presented with emotion attached to them. When she was done, Prentice looked at her across the table with the expression of someone who was going to say something that was not professionally required and was saying it anyway. What you did yesterday, he said, is going to be in the case record, but it's also going to be in the IG's formal commendation file. I want you to know that. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He looked at her steadily. You saved a senior military officer from a targeted assassination that was designed to look like a medical complication. You identified a network operative who would have walked out of this building undetected. You did it while your own job was actively being dismantled around you. He paused. I know you didn't do any of that for recognition. I'm telling you anyway. She looked at him. She didn't say thank you because it felt insufficient, and also because it wasn't quite what the moment called for. She said, make sure specialist... She stopped. She didn't know the specialist's name, the 23-year-old in the rear vehicle. The soldier who didn't make it, make sure her family has what they need. Prentice's expression shifted. I will. Okay, she said. Then I'm going to go do my job. At 9:45 that morning, Hospital Administrator Margaret Hollis called a meeting of department heads and senior nursing staff in the third-floor conference room. Maya was not a department head, and she was not senior nursing staff in any official capacity, and she received the meeting invitation anyway, which told her that the meeting was going to be about something specific. There were 14 people in the room when she arrived. Velasquez was there, and Lana, and Tricia, and the chief nursing officer, a woman named Dr. Pamela Seun, who had been in her position for 11 years and ran the nursing division with the particular combination of administrative efficiency and genuine clinical respect that made people want to work for her. Several physicians Maya recognized from overlapping ER rotations. The hospital's legal team, represented by someone who was not Dr. Fenwick, which was notable. Hollis was at the head of the table. She was a small woman in her 60s with the compact authority of someone who had run a large institution for long enough to not be surprised by very much. But she looked tired in a way that went past the professional, and she looked at Maya when Maya came in with an expression that had something effortful in it. "Thank you all for being here," she said when the room had settled. "I'll be direct. Yesterday's events revealed serious misconduct by this hospital's emergency department director, Dr. Adrian Cole, including actions that endangered patients and actively facilitated a federal crime. The full scope of the investigation is ongoing, and we are cooperating fully with federal authorities." She paused. "We also have to address what happened here, within these walls, to a member of our own staff." She looked at Maya. R.N. Whitmore has been a member of this team for over 2 years. During that time, she was systematically subjected to a pattern of professional obstruction, including a corrective action plan that has now been reviewed and determined to have been initiated without legitimate clinical basis. Hollis's voice was measured. It was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was something. Dr. Cole's file contains documentation of a deliberate campaign to restrict and ultimately remove R.N. Whitmore from the clinical floor. That campaign was not supported by her performance record, which is, I have to be direct, exceptional. The room was very quiet. The corrective action plan has been voided. R.N. Whitmore's personnel record at this institution has been corrected, and I want to say, on behalf of this administration, Hollis looked at her again, and something in her expression had moved past procedural into something more human and less comfortable, which was probably what honesty looked like when you were the head of an institution that had failed someone. "We are sorry for what you experienced here. That doesn't cover it, but it's what I have to offer you in this room right now." The silence held for a few seconds. Lena, from her seat 2 chairs down, was looking at the table. Tricia had her hands folded in front of her. Velasquez was looking at Maya with the expression of a man who was doing math about several things simultaneously, including things he should have done differently. "Thank you," Maya said. It was the right word for this, unlike the earlier situation. She meant it, and she meant it without warmth toward the institution and with something closer to acknowledgement, the recognition that this was being said in this room with these witnesses, which mattered in the way that public acknowledgments of wrong things matter. Not because they undo them, because they place them correctly in the record. "There's also a personnel matter we'd like to discuss," Seun said, from her position beside Hollis. She was looking at Maya with the specific focus of someone who had been waiting to get to this part. "Given the circumstances, this is somewhat irregular timing, but we believe it's appropriate." She looked at Hollis, who nodded. "We've been reviewing the ER's organizational structure in light of recent events. The position of clinical lead for emergency trauma nursing, which has been functionally vacant since the previous lead left 14 months ago, and which Dr. Cole blocked from being filled, is open. We'd like to offer it to you." Maya looked at Seun. She looked at the table. She looked at the room full of people who had, 12 hours ago, been somewhere between confused, frightened, and passively complicit in the institutional machine that had been grinding against her for 2 years. She was not going to say yes in this room. That was not the right process, and she knew it. "I'll consider it," she said. "I'd want to see the scope in writing and discuss the structural reporting changes that would need to go with it." Seun looked like someone who had expected either immediate acceptance or refusal, and had not prepared for the third option, which was a professional negotiation. She recovered quickly. "Of course. I'll have the documentation to you by end of day." The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, covering investigative process protocols and staff communication and the interim leadership structure for the ER during the period before a permanent director was named. Maya listened and contributed when her perspective was directly relevant and did not fill silences that didn't need filling. When it ended and people were standing and gathering their things, Lena moved to her side without ceremony and said very quietly, "You're going to take it." "Probably," Maya said, just as quietly. "Good." Lena picked up her folder. "The hemostatic gauze protocol needs to be rewritten. I already wrote it up, twice. Write it up again. This time, someone will sign it." Well, at 2 in the afternoon, a federal prosecutor named Osei Tamboli arrived at Hargrove with a different category of questions. Not investigative, but evidential. The kind of questions that shaped court records and charging documents. He met with Maya for 40 minutes in a conference room, and she walked him through the same sequence she'd walked through with Prentice, with additional clinical detail on the potassium toxicity and the IV bag, because that element was going to be central to the attempted murder charge and it needed to be airtight. When he was done, Tamboli closed his folder and said, "The defense is going to argue that you had no clinical authorization to intervene in the colonel's care, and that your actions, while ultimately beneficial, represented a pattern of unauthorized behavior consistent with an unstable or impaired professional." "I know. Is there anything in your record that supports that characterization?" "My record is available," she said, "full and unredacted as of last night. I'd encourage you to read it." He looked at her. She could see him doing the thing attorneys did when they were evaluating a witness, gauging whether she was going to hold up, whether the composure was structural or decorative, whether she was the kind of person who broke in the wrong direction under specific kinds of pressure. She had been evaluated this way before, by people with more training in the process than Tamboli, and she looked back at him without performing anything. "You'll be a strong witness," he said, not as a compliment, but as a clinical assessment. "I know what I did and why I did it," she said. "I can explain it in plain language without embellishment. That tends to work." He nodded and left. She was back on the floor by 3, working the afternoon into the evening in the way she always did, methodical, present, attentive to the particular needs of whatever was in front of her. The floor felt different today, and she was aware of that difference without trying to define it too precisely. People spoke to her with a directness they hadn't always had. Priya brought her coffee from the second-floor machine, the bad coffee, because the sub-level supply was still out, and delivered it with the slightly stunned look of someone who had rewired a significant piece of their professional understanding in the last 24 hours. Holbrook stopped her near Bay 3 in the late afternoon. He had been thinking about something for a while. She could see the look of a man who had been composing a sentence and was finally prepared to deliver it. "I should have flagged Metz when he asked for the phone," he said. "I waited too long." "You flagged him," she said. You came to me. That's what mattered." "I should have been faster." "Yes," she agreed, because he was right, and she was not going to tell him otherwise. "Next time you will be." He blinked. He'd probably expected absolution rather than concurrence. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "Okay." She kept moving. At 5:40, Voss called her. "Pruitt resigned this afternoon," Voss said without preamble. "Pending the military investigation, he's separated from active service effective immediately. It's not the end of the process. The JAG case is ongoing, but it's the first formal consequence." Maya was at the supply room, pulling inventory, a clipboard in her hand. She stood still for a moment. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I thought you should hear it from me before it hits the news cycle." A pause. "It's going to be public by tomorrow morning. Your name may come up in the reporting as a peripheral figure. I can manage that." "I know you can." Another pause, and in it something that was as close to personal as Voss seemed to get. "You held this together yesterday. A lot of the pieces we needed, you found them. I want you to know I'm putting that in my report." Maya looked at the clipboard. The hemostatic gauze inventory number was still wrong. She made a note. "Do what you need to do with your report," she said. "I'm going to go fix a supply order." Voss was quiet for one beat, and then she laughed. A short, dry sound, genuine enough to be surprising. "Good night, Whitmore." "Good night." She ended the call and kept working. At 6:15, while she was finishing the last of her documentation for the shift, the overhead PA system activated again. Not a security notification this time. The standard administrative announcement voice. The one that sounded like it was being read by someone who had never met a dramatic situation they couldn't flatten. "Attention hospital staff. This is a message from Administrator Hollis. Effective immediately. The corrective action file pertaining to RN Maya Whitmore is voided and removed from the hospital's personnel record. This action is confirmed in writing and will be communicated to all relevant departments. Additionally, a formal letter of appreciation for clinical conduct during yesterday's mass casualty event will be entered into RN Whitmore's personnel file. The floor did not erupt. People did not clap. This was a hospital, not a stadium, and the people on the clinical floor at 6:15 on a Wednesday evening had work to do. But Tricia from across the station looked up and held Maya's eyes for a long moment. And Darren, on his way past with a medication cart, bumped her shoulder lightly with his, just once, without stopping. Maya looked back at her screen. She saved her last chart of the shift and closed the program and sat for a moment with her hands on the desk and the quiet of the floor around her. The monitors, the ventilators, the ordinary, persistent noise of a building keeping people alive. She reached into her pocket. The folded document from the JAG officer. Calloway's note. She didn't take them out. She just felt the weight of them. Thin paper, ordinary paper, carrying the specific mass of things that had been wrong for a long time and were now, imperfectly and incompletely, but truthfully, being made right. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number, local area code. She picked it up. RN Whitmore. The voice was male, middle-aged, careful. Not a voice she recognized. My name is Dr. Garrett Finch. I'm the incoming director of emergency medicine at Hargrove Medical Center. I've just been appointed by the board on an interim basis pending a permanent search. I'd like to meet with you tomorrow morning if you're available. I'm available, she said. There are some things I'd like to discuss about the department's direction going forward. He paused. And I've been reading your file. The full one. I'd like to understand how we managed to have someone with your background working as a floor nurse for 2 years without anyone at the leadership level recognizing what they had. Maya was quiet for exactly 1 second. So would I, she said. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a conversation that had just established its ground and was preparing to build on it, and somewhere in that silence was the specific, unannounced shape of something that was about to change. She stayed on the line. She stayed on the line. The conversation with Dr. Finch lasted 22 minutes, which was longer than she'd expected and more substantive than a preliminary introduction had any right to be. He asked specific questions, not about the events of Tuesday, which he said he'd read in full and didn't need her to narrate again, but about the floor itself. The gauze protocol. The triage algorithm Cole had implemented and its measurable effect on patient throughput. The camera maintenance backlog. The things that a person noticed when they paid attention and nobody was asking them to report to anyone. She answered everything. She was direct about what worked and what didn't, which included some things that had nothing to do with Cole and everything to do with systemic decisions that had predated him. Finch listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been in people at his level. At the end he said, "I'll see you tomorrow at 7:30. And she said yes, and she hung up and sat in the parking lot of her apartment building for 4 minutes before going inside, which was not something she usually did, but which felt necessary tonight. The mountains were dark against a sky that had gone the deep blue-black of a clear November night, and the city below them was doing what cities did. Lights on, lights off, people moving through their lives without awareness of the building on the hill where 2 days ago everything had shifted. She sat with that for a moment. The ordinariness of everything outside the thing you've just survived. How the world keeps its own pace regardless. Then she went inside. The federal arraignment of Adrian Cole took place 3 weeks later in a courtroom in Denver. The charges were read into the record by the prosecutor's office. Conspiracy to commit murder, sabotage of military operations, material support of an attack on federal personnel, medical fraud, and unauthorized access to a government routing system. Cole sat at the defense table in a suit that was more expensive than anything he'd ever worn at Hargrove, and his attorney sat beside him with the professional composure of someone being paid very well to maintain it. The courtroom was not large, and it was not full, because federal arraignments rarely drew crowds. But there were people present who had not been required to come. Prentice was there, in civilian clothes. Voss was there. 3 members of Calloway's convoy team, the ones who had been treated and discharged, sat in the gallery in civilian dress that wore them exactly the way it always did. Maya was not there. She had been asked if she wanted to attend, and she had said no, which was a decision she'd thought about and made with the same directness she applied to most things. She had given her statement. She had done her part. The legal process had its own momentum now, and it did not need her presence to validate it. She was on the trauma floor at Hargrove when the arraignment happened, working a shift that had started at 6:40 and would end at 1900, managing a rotation of patients with the practiced efficiency of someone who had recently been confirmed in the senior clinical lead role for emergency trauma nursing. A confirmation that had come after a 2-week process that was less smooth than the administrator's announcement had made it sound and more real for that reason. She'd negotiated 3 structural changes to the reporting relationship, one addition to the scope document, and a provision for quarterly protocol reviews that would put clinical nursing staff at the table with physicians when procedural standards were set. Seun had agreed to all of it after 2 rounds of discussion, which was also how real things got done. Darren told her the arraignment had happened via a text message at 11:47. She was mid-chart. She read it, put her phone face down, and finished the chart. Then she pulled up the next one. Whoa. Harlan Metz pleaded guilty in a separate proceeding 6 weeks after that, under a cooperation agreement that reduced his sentence in exchange for testimony against the broader network. The network itself, the structure above Cole and Metz, the organizational layer that had placed Cole and tracked Maya's suppressed record and accessed convoy routes through a chain of embedded individuals, was going to take years to fully dismantle. Prentice told her this in a phone call in January, and he was honest about the fact that some of it might never be fully exposed. That's how these things work, he said. You get the edges. Sometimes you get more. What about Cole's sentence? Minimum of 18 years on the federal charges. The state AG is considering additional charges on the medical fraud, which would add time. He paused. The attempted murder count on Calloway is the one that's going to hold the most weight. The potassium evidence is clean. Your testimony will be central. I know. She was in the hospital cafeteria eating a sandwich she'd remembered to bring from home for once, watching the Denver Falls skyline through the window. I'll be ready. I know you will. A pause. Pruitt's case is moving. JAG is preparing formal charges. The suppression of your record is part of the evidentiary package. Not the central charge, but it's in there. It establishes pattern and motive for his involvement in the placement operation. She ate a corner of the sandwich. Is he going to try to make a deal? His attorneys are exploring it. The military justice system doesn't move fast, but the fact that a sitting general's suppression of a subordinate's personnel record directly enabled a conspiracy that killed a 23-year-old specialist, his voice was measured. That's not something that gets dealt away cheaply. She thought about the specialist. She still didn't know her name. She had asked Prentice in December and he had told her and she had written it down. Specialist Anaya Reyes, 23 years old, from Albuquerque, New Mexico, 14 months into her first field rotation. She had looked at the name for a long time, and then she had folded the paper and put it in the same drawer as the JAG document and Calloway's note and the record restoration confirmation, and she had gone back to work. She thought about Anaya Reyes a lot, not in a way that stopped her, but in the way that things that matter don't leave you. They just find a place in the structure of how you move through the world, and they stay there. Thank you, she told Prentice. Thank you, he said, and he meant it differently than she had, and they both understood the difference, and the call ended there. Calloway came back in February. Not to the hospital. He came to Denver Falls, which was close enough. He was 4 months out from the injuries and walking without assistance, which he'd apparently been doing ahead of the projected timeline in a way that had irritated his physical therapist and was entirely consistent with everything Maya remembered about him. He called first, which she had not expected, and asked if she had time for coffee, which she also had not expected, and she said yes because there wasn't a version of herself that could honestly say no. They met at a place on Kellerman Street, 3 blocks from her apartment, that had reasonable coffee and booths that were private enough for conversations that weren't for general consumption. He arrived 2 minutes after she did, and he looked like himself, older than she remembered from the deployment years because they both were, and carrying the specific physical awareness of someone who had recently been very close to not surviving and had not yet fully forgotten what that felt like. He sat down and looked at her and said, "You look the same." "I'm not," she said. "No." He acknowledged this without argument. "Neither am I." They talked for 2 hours. They talked about the case, the parts they could discuss, the parts that were still under seal, and about the investigation into Pruitt, and about Anaya Reyes in the way that military people talked about people they'd lost, which was direct and honest and without the softening that civilians sometimes tried to bring to those conversations. They talked about what Maya was doing now, the clinical lead role, the protocol changes, the training sessions she'd started running for the nursing staff that were drawing, unexpectedly, attending physicians as well. That doesn't surprise me, Calloway said. It surprised me a little. It shouldn't. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He looked at her with the directness he'd always had, the one that used to make her uncomfortable because it didn't leave room for evasion. Why did you really leave, after the testimony? She'd known the question was coming since he sat down. She'd been deciding how to answer it since she'd said yes to coffee. Because I told the truth, she said, and I watched what happened to the person I told the truth about, and then I watched nothing happen to the person who protected him, and I realized I didn't know how to keep working in a structure where those two things were equally true simultaneously. She looked at her cup. So I left, and I told myself it was a choice. It was a choice. It was also a defeat. She said it without drama. I know that now. I didn't know it then, or I knew it, and I called it something else. Calloway was quiet for a moment. The network knew about your suppression. They used it. They thought it meant you weren't a threat. Yes. They were wrong. Yes. She looked up. But they weren't wrong about what had been done to me. They were wrong about what it meant. He held her gaze for a long time. There was a lot in that look. The shared history of the deployment years, the 4 years of her disappearance, the specific and unrepeatable fact of his eyes finding her across a trauma bay on a Tuesday afternoon and knowing exactly who she was. What did it mean? He asked. She thought about it. The real answer, not the diplomatic one. It meant someone tried to make me smaller than I was. And I let them, for a while. And then I stopped. He nodded once. Just once. Like that was exactly the right answer and he'd been waiting to hear it. They finished their coffee. When they stood up to leave, he said, I'm going to give your name to the Army's Joint Medical Training Program. They're building a civilian advisory component for combat trauma response integration. It's consultant work, part-time, compatible with your current position. Your background is exactly what they need. She looked at him. You could have led with that. I wanted to have coffee first. She almost smiled. I'll think about it. You'll say yes, he said, without arrogance. Just the flatness of someone who knew her well enough to assess the odds accurately. She didn't argue. The training program that Maya built at Hargrove across the following months was not elegant. It was not the kind of thing that looked good on a promotional brochure because it was designed around failure, around what went wrong in the first minutes of a mass casualty event, around the specific ways clinical confidence broke down under pressure, around the gap between what nurses and physicians were trained to do and what the situation actually required. She ran it on Tuesday mornings, which was a choice she made without ever explaining to anyone, and the sessions were uncomfortable in the productive way of things that made people confront the distance between what they thought they knew and what they actually did. Priya attended every session. She got better every week in ways that were visible and ways that weren't. By April, she was the one Maya trusted to run the simulation components, which Priya did with a focused seriousness that had replaced the wide-eyed anxiety of the first-year nurse in Bay 4 who had hesitated for 1 second before getting the needle. 1 second was 1 second. She didn't hesitate anymore. Holbrook attended and brought 2 residents who attended after him, which was not something Maya had asked for, and which was the kind of thing that happened when you stopped trying to create outcomes and started doing the work in front of you. Velasquez came once, stood in the back, and never said anything about it afterward. But 3 weeks later, he changed his intubation verification protocol to match something Maya had mentioned in passing during a session without citing the source, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Lena attended 3 sessions and then said, I know all of this, which was largely true, and Maya said, then help me teach it, which was how Lena became the co-facilitator of the Tuesday morning program without anyone formally making that decision. The floor changed. Not overnight, not completely, not without friction. Change in institutions moved the way rivers moved, gradually, with resistance, carving its shape over time rather than announcing it. The hemostatic gauze protocol was rewritten and signed. The camera maintenance backlog was cleared. The triage algorithm was revised in a working group that included 3 nurses, which had apparently never happened before in the department's history, a fact that said everything it needed to say. Dr. Finch, the interim director who eventually became the permanent director after a national search that he won over 4 other candidates, had a management style that was different from Cole's in almost every measurable way. He was not always easy to work with. He had strong opinions about resource allocation and a tendency to be impatient with process when he thought the outcome was obvious, which was a recognizable flaw in talented people who moved fast. Maya disagreed with him openly on 2 occasions in the first 3 months, and both times the disagreement resulted in a better outcome than either of their original positions, which was the best-case scenario for disagreement between people who were both trying to get the right answer. He told her once, in the corridor without preamble, "Cole flagged you as a problem before I even started. It's in his handover notes. He called you disruptive and difficult to manage." "I know," she said. "He meant it as a warning." Finch looked at her with the expression of someone stating an obvious thing that needed to be stated anyway. "I read it as a recommendation." She didn't thank him for that. She just nodded and went back to work, which was the right response to a truth that didn't require elaboration. In May, the federal trial of Adrian Cole began. It lasted 11 days. Maya testified on the 4th day, for 3 hours and 40 minutes, and she answered every question the way she answered all questions, accurately, without embellishment, in language that was specific and clinical and accessible, the way she'd learned to communicate in environments where imprecision had consequences. The defense attorney attempted twice to reframe her interventions as reckless and unauthorized. She explained both times the clinical basis for each decision she had made, the timeline, the patient outcome, and the documented evidence that the interventions were both indicated and effective. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. Guilty on all charges. Cole received 22 years on the federal sentence. The state medical board had already moved to permanently revoke his medical license 6 weeks before the verdict, which was a quieter and in some ways more complete form of consequence, the permanent removal of the credential that had given him the authority he had used to do damage. Metz received 12 years under his cooperation agreement. The broader network investigation continued. It would continue for a long time. Some parts of it would result in additional charges and convictions. Some parts would reach the edge of what evidence could establish and stop there, unresolved, which was the reality of investigations that reached into structures designed to resist exposure. Maya understood this without accepting it as a reason to feel the outcome was incomplete. The people she knew about had faced consequences. The specialist had been remembered in the official record. The record of what had been done to Maya herself had been corrected, publicly and permanently, in a federal case file that would outlast everyone in this story. That was not everything. It was not nothing. General Pruitt was formally charged by the Judge Advocate General's office in April with conduct unbecoming an officer, abuse of authority, and conspiracy. He faced a court-martial, which was the appropriate venue for a senior officer who had used his rank to punish someone for telling the truth, and who had allowed that punishment to connect, however indirectly, to the operational network that had gotten a 23-year-old killed. His attorneys negotiated extensively. The proceeding moved at the deliberate pace of military justice, which was slow and thorough and did not bend easily to external pressure. Maya did not follow the daily progress of the court-martial. She knew its general shape. She knew the outcome, when it came in late summer, was a reduction in rank, loss of retirement benefits, and a formal letter of censure in the permanent record, not incarceration, which was a limitation of what the specific charges could support, and which she had understood was a possible outcome. She sat with that for a day. Then she went to work. She thought sometimes about what it would mean for justice to be complete. She had decided, somewhere in the months between Tuesday and November and this summer, that complete was not the right category. The right category was sufficient. Sufficient consequence to establish that what happened was wrong, sufficient accountability to change the conditions that allowed it, sufficient record to ensure that the people who had done the wrong things were correctly identified, and the person who had been wronged was correctly identified too. Anaya Reyes's name was in the federal trial record as the victim whose death had been enabled by Cole's actions. It was in the court-martial record as the reason the conspiracy had consequences beyond institutional misconduct. Her family had been present at the arraignment. They had been informed of every development by Prentice's office, which had taken that obligation seriously. Maya had written them a letter, not about the trial, not about the investigation, just about what she knew of Specialist Reyes in the limited way she had known it, which was through Calloway and through the convoy personnel she had treated and through the shape of a loss that had been present in the bay on that Tuesday in November, even before she understood whose it was. She had written it carefully, and she had not expected a response, and one came anyway, 3 weeks later, from Reyes's mother, a paragraph that Maya had read once and folded and put in the drawer with the other things. She would not tell you what it said. Some things were not for sharing. On a Tuesday morning in September, a morning that was cold the way Denver Falls mornings got in September, the mountains already carrying the first snow of the season on their upper faces, Maya arrived at Hargrove at 6:40 as she always did, and went to the supply room and checked the hemostatic gauze inventory as she always did, and found it correctly stocked, which was no longer a surprise but had not become unremarkable either. She ran the morning simulation at 7. 6 nurses, 2 residents, Priya co-facilitating at the front of the room with the case she'd earned in the months since she'd stood in Bay 4 not quite knowing whether to move. The scenario was a mass casualty event. A vehicle collision, multiple critical injuries, resource scarcity, a team that had to make decisions faster than the information supported. They got most of it right. They got some of it wrong. Maya walked through both with equal directness, because the point was not to perform success, but to build the capacity to handle what came next. Afterward, in the corridor, one of the residents, a second-year named Park, who had been coming since February and had quietly become one of the best performers in the sessions, stopped her. "How do you stay calm?" he asked. "In an actual event? When it's real? How do you actually do that?" She looked at him. He was asking sincerely, not rhetorically, the way young physicians sometimes asked things when they'd finally shed enough defensiveness to admit they didn't know. "You don't stay calm," she said. "You stay useful. Those are different things." She looked down the corridor toward the bays. Calm is an emotion. Useful is a decision. You can make the decision even when the emotion is anything but calm. He thought about this. "Is that how you learned it?" "I learned it in harder rooms than this," she said, "but it applies here the same." She went back to the floor. She had 4 patients to check on, a protocol review meeting at 10, a call with the Army's Joint Medical Training Liaison at noon about the advisory curriculum she was building with Calloway's program. She had a full shift and a list of things that needed doing, and a building she knew better than its architects, and a floor that was, imperfectly and continuously and without any guarantee of permanent rightness, getting better. She had been told she was ordinary. She had been told she was too much. She had been told, by the administrative architecture of a system built around someone else's interests, that her qualifications did not exist. None of those things had been true, and the evidence was not in the verdict or the commendation or the title on the updated org chart, though those things mattered. The evidence was in the 3 patients who had gone home when they shouldn't have. In Calloway's heart beating in steady sinus rhythm. In Priya standing at the front of a training room explaining thoracic assessment to a resident who hadn't known to ask the question 6 months ago. The evidence was in the work. It had always been in the work. That was the thing about people who overlooked you. They thought invisibility was the same as absence. They thought that because they couldn't see your value, it wasn't there. They built their certainties around what they chose to notice and what they chose not to notice, and they called the combination expertise. But the work didn't care what they thought. The work existed whether they saw it or not. The patients were alive or they weren't, and that fact was not negotiable, and that fact was the only verdict that had ever mattered to Maya Whitmore. She went to Bay 1. Her first patient of the morning was a woman in her 50s with chest pain and an anxiety about hospitals that was visible in the way she gripped the rail of the bed, and Maya introduced herself and asked the relevant questions and listened to the answers with the full attention of someone who had learned in the hardest possible way that the person in front of you was always the most important thing in the room. She was a nurse. She was the best trauma clinical lead this floor had ever had. She was a veteran who had saved lives in places that didn't appear on maps, and a consultant to a military training program, and a witness in a federal case, and the person who had looked at a saline bag in the worst hour of a terrible day and known that something was wrong. She was all of these things at once, and none of them were separate from the others. She pulled up a chair, sat beside the woman with the chest pain and the gripped rail, and began.